Good morning. This lecture is part of the topic, the outcome, measuring effects of vaccines in pediatrics. The goal of your lecture today is to appraise the specifics of the safety section of the Phase 3 clinical trial protocol for a pediatric vaccine. My name is Dr. Egama Babatunde Mokwede. I am from the University of Oxford, and I'm going to take you through the lecture Safety Considerations in the Conduct of Clinical Trials of Candidate Vaccines. We're going to look at, by introduction, why safety. We're going to look at the important definitions that you should know, safety considerations in clinical trial protocols, and then by way of conclusion, we're going to look at safety reporting checklist, things you should remember. Issues around scientific malpractices and serious fraud in clinical practice has led to the introduction of good clinical practice in the conduct of clinical trials worldwide. The GCP guidelines issued by the International Conference on Harmonization, ICH, was approved on 17 July 1996 with clinical trial implementation in January 1997. GCP training is probably now the most basic ethical and practical standard to be attained before researchers embark on the conduct of clinical research. I have put in the slide 31, that will look at the history of GCP as a supplementary slide, which I believe will be a reading reference for you. With a more widespread use of the implementation of these ICH guidelines and other local regulations by the European Medical Association and the US FDA, clinical trials conducted worldwide are now required to follow the same internationally acceptable standards. I'm going to look at two published reviews which have the potential to improve safety reporting of vaccine trials from low and medium income countries and call for wider implementation of standard safety monitoring and reporting malpractices. A review of 214 publications of safety data collection in pre-licensure clinical trials of HIV, malaria, and TB vaccines by Taminga et al. Suggests that there is a need to urgently pursue the standardization of safety data collection and reporting for clinical trials. In this paper, reporting of safety data varied highly among the publications and was often incomplete. Only about a third of manuscripts specified the observed local and systemic adverse events. Important information such as severity of adverse events or relatedness to vaccination was often missing. There was often inconsistency between the methods and results sections. Frequency of reporting and consistency between methods, as you can see on this graph here on your right, and results sections in clinical trials of vaccines against malaria and HIV and TB by Taminga et al. In 2013 explains what I was trying to say with this text on the left. The studies concluded that significant value will be added to each study if data generated from clinical trials were comparable and standardization of safety data collection and reporting was pursued. As a first step, the Brighton Collaboration Clinical Trial Working Group, which you can look more about Brighton Collaboration on this website, which was part of an European community-funded clinical project, INIVAX, published a manuscript that outlines a template clinical trial protocol focusing on the safety elements. These safety elements, which we highlight later in some of the slides, should be taken into consideration as guidance in writing up clinical trial protocols in Important definition. Good clinical practice, GCP. It's an international, ethical, and scientific quality standard for the design, conduct, and record of research involving humans. There are 13 core principles which are self-explanatory, and I'm giving you a reference here. Adverse events is an important definition. Any untoward medical occurrence in a clinical investigation subject, administered a pharmaceutical product, and occurring in any phase of the clinical study, whether or not considered related to the vaccine. This includes an exacerbation of pre-existing conditions or events, intercurrent illnesses, or vaccine or drug interaction. An adverse drug reaction is any untoward or intended response to a medicinal product. This means that the causal relationship between the study medication and an adverse event is at least a reasonable possibility. Serious adverse event. A serious adverse event, experience, or reaction is any untoward medical occurrence that at any dose results in death, is life-threatening, requires inpatient hospitalization or prolongation of existing hospitalization, results in persistent or significant disability, incapacity, or is a congenital anomaly or birth defect. The suspected unexpected serious adverse event or reaction is an SAE that's unexpected and thought to be related to the investigational product. Normally, administration of further vaccines within the trial will be suspended until the safety review is convened. Quality assurance. All those planned and systematic actions that are established to ensure that the trial is performed and the data are generated, documented, and reported in compliance with GCP and the applicable regulatory requirements. Quality control. The operational techniques and activities undertaken within the quality assurance system to verify that the requirements for the quality of the clinical trial-related activities have been fulfilled. Safety considerations in vaccine trials. These points I will mention as we go ahead are important points that we must take into consideration when we're talking about clinical trials of candidate vaccines, especially prophylactic vaccines. A clinical trial application to include relevant documents, that's clinical trial protocol, informed consent documentation, investigative brochure, and other documents, must be submitted to and approved by an established independent ethics committee, or IRB as they're called, or regulatory authority before a clinical trial can be conducted in the country. An independent ethics committee or institutional review board are expected to safeguard the rights, safety, and well-being of all clinical trial participants, especially clinical trials that may include vulnerable participants. Vulnerable participants may include those people with psychiatric, cognitive, or developmental disorders, children, women of childbearing age, prisoners, employees, students, etc. Regulatory authority approvals. Regulatory authorities, or maybe also be known as competent authorities, are responsible for providing regulations for the conduct of research in specific countries. In most African countries, regulatory approval is required before an import license is granted for importation of vaccines for use in a clinical trial. Informed consent. An ongoing process by which a participant voluntarily confirms his unwillingness to participate in a particular clinical trial after being informed of all aspects of the clinical trial relevant to his or her decision to participate. This is very important. Documented informed consent, usually by means of a written, signed, and dated informed consent form, by a participant or parent or guardian in cases of children. Thumbprints are used in place of signatures for those who cannot read or write. A written, signed, and dated informed consent should be in place before any clinical trial procedures begin. Adherence to clinical trial protocol. A clinical trial protocol is a document that describes the background, the rationale, the objectives, design, methodology, statistical considerations, and organization of a clinical trial. It's important to note that complying with the contents of the approved clinical trial protocol is essential to ensure that the safety of the participants is maintained and data collected is of acceptable quality. It is best practice. So these are already important points that we need to note. The clinical protocol should briefly outline safety information on existing vaccines targeting the same disease, justify clinical trial design with reference to the route of administration, dose, and dose schedule, state the assessment of safety as a primary or secondary objective depending on the clinical trial phase, adequately explain the clinical trial design, that is randomization, blinding, and control, explain the statistical considerations relevant to the clinical trial design, including sample size for the trial and statistical power calculations. Outline and clearly describe the inclusion and exclusion criteria, as these are very important for the selection and safety of participants. Outline the process for withdrawal of participants either on his own volition or by the decision of the principal investigator should be clearly stated. I have written out a reference below here. That would be important to look at some of these things. These are all stated in this publication. The CTP should also outline the plan to locate a clinical trial participant when considered to be lost to follow-up to determine his health status. It's important to ensure that you find out what is wrong with the volunteer or subject if he goes missing for any reason. You clearly describe the investigational vaccine, state requirements on transportation and storage of the vaccine accountability, vaccination safety precautions and instructions, and vaccine administration. It describes the process for dealing with the prior and concomitant medications, that is, medications being taken before or during the clinical trial that are not part of the clinical trial. Clearly outline plans for sampling of participants and management, that is, preparation, handling, storage, shipment, transportation of the samples. Clearly outline safety tests to be conducted during the course of the clinical trial. The CTP should also outline the management of birth control, new pregnancy of clinical participants if this happens during the clinical trial. Clearly outline adverse event assessment and management. In evaluating the safety case, you need to look at the nature of the event. You have to do a causality assessment. Could this have been caused by administration of the vaccines? How serious it is? Is it serious adverse event as per the definition I've given before? Is it an expected occurrence? These 4 points are important in evaluating the safety case. Now, severity of adverse events or adverse reaction. Looking at this table, I won't go through all of it, but the main classifications are mild, moderate, and severe. Mild reactions typically do not require treatment, medical intervention, or therapy. Moderate requires no or minimal treatment or medical intervention. Severe reactions are usually incapacitating. that you should note. Safety data collection. Principally, safety data collection is done at 3 stages. Baseline assessment, that's before you start any clinical trial procedures, following each vaccination, and at the follow-up period, that is after post-vaccination. You clearly define solicited adverse events following vaccination. The Biotech collaboration has case definitions which are very available. An SAE and a SUSA as per our previous definitions. Codes for grading severity assessment should be clearly outlined in clinical trial protocol. Outcome of events at last observation should be clearly described. And timelines for validating adverse events or serious adverse events should be clearly stated in clinical trial protocol. Usually, all SAEs should be reported to the sponsor immediately or within 24 hours after the PI has become aware of its occurrence. Continuing safety data collection, the TTP should describe eligible source documents where information is first recorded before being transcribed to the CRF. That is, source documents are where information is first recorded before being transcribed to the case report forms. Appropriate case report forms and diary cards that capture the essence of the clinical trial protocol should be developed before the clinical trial starts. An appropriate database that captures the essence of the case report form and the diary cards are important before the clinical trial starts, and that's why it's important to involve data managers early enough in the planning of your clinical trial. Your plan for record retention varies from country to country. It could be specific or specific to a sponsor, but the ICH GCP states 2 years after the last approval of marketing application in an ICH region, or 2 years after discontinuation of clinical development of the investigational product. But my experience is usually between 5 to 10 years for most sponsors. Reporting to the ethics committees or regulatory authorities or the sponsor. Investigators should note the safety reporting requirements, that is, responsible reporters, methods of reporting, minimal reporting requirements, time frame as stated in clinical trial, and specific country ethical committee and regulatory authority guidelines. These requirements must be strictly followed. Most regulatory authorities typically require reporting of serious and unexpected events related to the vaccine within 15 calendar days. Death and life-threatening events are reported within 7 days. Relevant follow-up reports should be sent within 24 hours. Unrelated SAEs are reported as part of annual reports. Follow-up. Safety criteria for stopping the participation of a volunteer or for halting the clinical trial should be agreed and clearly described in the clinical trial protocol. The PI should act to stop the participation of the volunteer, but the responsibility for stopping the clinical trial rests with the sponsor. Sample storage for future use. Sample storage is useful if further investigation is required when unexpected safety issues arise. Data Safety Monitoring Board, DSMB, or what some may call Data Safety Monitoring Committees, DSMCs. These bodies are usually set up by the sponsor to monitor the safety data of participants enrolled in clinical trial in order to prevent the occurrence of serious disease, reduce the risk of a major adverse health outcome or death. A DSMB may be set up for all clinical trials of candidate vaccines, preferably from the first in-man clinical trials. These should be maintained if the clinical development of the vaccine progresses to later stages. These bodies usually comprise of 3 to 5 members who should be completely independent of the clinical trial team. Expertise for these boards should be drawn from clinical trialists, clinical medicine, clinical epidemiologists, vaccinologists, and statisticians. A formal training in vaccine safety DSMB procedure should be a prerequisite for membership of these bodies, especially in resource-poor countries. The DSMB should be given the opportunity to review and offer opinion on the clinical trial protocol and data safety monitoring plans prior to the start of the clinical trial. The members should be provided with blinded and semi-blinded data so that they can assess trends in the frequency or severity of an adverse event. DSMBs are especially useful when the clinical trial design provides for interim analysis prior to progression from one stage of the clinical trial to another, or from one phase of the clinical development to the next. Clinical trial monitoring. This is the act of overseeing the progress of a clinical trial and of ensuring that it is conducted, recorded, and reported in accordance with the protocol, SOPs, GCP, and the applicable requirements. You can find this in the ICH GCP section 5.18. The purposes of clinical trial monitoring to verify that the rights and well-being of human subjects are protected, the reported clinical trial data are accurate, complete, and verifiable from source documents, and the conduct of clinical trials in compliance with the currently approved clinical trial or its amendments, GCP, and the applicable regulatory requirements. An adequately qualified independent clinical trial monitor should be appointed by the sponsor. The CTM usually acts as the main line of communication between the sponsor and the investigator. Monitoring details that will include the clinical trial monitoring responsibilities, frequency of monitoring visits, source documents to be reviewed should be specified in the monitoring plan agreed with the PI. Monitoring reports should be submitted to the sponsor after each clinical trial monitoring visit. Findings should be clearly stated with timelines for response from the PI. Safety case reporting checklist. By way of conclusion, we must ensure first to identify the occurrence, whether it's an adverse event, an SAE, or a SUSAR. I'll take you back again to the definitions that are given earlier, the important definitions. You check the reporting requirements in the clinical protocol report to the sponsor. You communicate clearly. Use correct forms for reporting. Provide all additional information as requested by the sponsor, and be aware of reporting timelines. These are references that will help you. Thank you very much.